Have you ever heard of foot binding? This practice, also known as lotus feet, was a deeply ingrained custom in ancient China. Traditionally, from a young age, a girl's feet were tightly wrapped with cloth strips to inhibit the growth of the bones, deforming the feet to maintain a length of just about 10 centimeters. This brutal aesthetic standard subjected nearly 200 million Chinese women to indescribable pain and physical limitation throughout their lives. But why did such a custom exist? How did it affect the lives and social status of women? Let's delve into the history of foot binding to uncover the deep cultural and societal factors behind it. In China, the aesthetic pursuit of the female form dates back centuries, with ancient sayings like, "The king of Chu loves a slender waist. So many girls starve in his palace," illustrating a preference for slender female figures. Poetry through the ages often extolled the virtues of women's petite bodies and graceful movements. According to records, the custom of foot binding began during the Song dynasty, initially started by a court dancer who bound her feet into the shape of a crescent moon to gain the emperor's favor. This practice quickly became regarded as the ultimate standard of feminine beauty and was widely emulated by noble women. Another possible reason for the popularity of this custom was that it served to accentuate social stratification, particularly distinguishing upper-class Han women from lower-class women. By the Ming and Qing dynasties, foot binding had become a widespread social norm, affecting girls in ordinary families as well. From a young age, each girl had to endure the pain of foot binding, a process that caused lasting physical harm and deeply affected their psychological and social activities. Foot binding typically began when girls were between the ages of 5 and 8, a time when their bones were still developing and more pliable. This task was usually carried out by the mother or a maid skilled in foot binding. During the process, all toes except the big toe were bent downwards and wrapped tightly with long strips of cloth, which were then sewn together to ensure they stayed in place. Foot binding was often undertaken in autumn since the cooler weather could slightly alleviate the pain involved. The first stage is the initial binding, involved preparing various tools such as binding cloths, cotton, and thread. The girls would sit on a chair while their feet were washed in hot water. Before the feet cooled, the 4 smaller toes were bent under the foot. Alum powder was sprinkled between the toes to tighten the skin and prevent inflammation, and the foot was then tightly wrapped with an 8 to 10 foot long cloth strip and sewn up securely. Finally, pointed cloth shoes were put on to complete this stage. The second stage, known as the tightening phase, was the most painful part of the process, lasting about 6 months. During this stage, the binding was undone every 3 days for disinfection and rebinding. Each rebinding required pressing the toes even harder towards the center of the foot. The girls were also encouraged to walk around, putting all their body weight on the misshapen toes and twisted joints, causing corns, inflammation, and severe pain that made walking difficult during the day. At night, their feet were bound up in the bedding, enduring intertwined pain and heat, making it unbearable. Accidental injuries during disinfection could lead to serious infections. The third phase, tight binding, aimed to permanently bend the foot bones into an arched shape. During this stage, the muscles in the foot would atrophy, and the dead skin would start to peel off, and the toes could become necrotic and fall off due to ulcers. The final stage involved bending the foot, where the arch of the foot was pulled up and the sole deeply indented, forming an arch shape. This phase required the feet to be bound as tightly as possible with cloth and shoes, and sometimes sticks were used to set the shape like a cast. After extensive effort, this process would result in a pair of feet known as bow feet. In ancient China, small feet were regarded as symbols of a woman's beauty, chastity, and nobility, making women with such traits highly favored in the marriage market. The society idolized 3-inch golden lotuses as the ideal standard for foot size, meaning the foot was about 3 inches long. Feet that measured within 4 inches were called silver lotuses, while those exceeding 4 inches were deemed iron lotuses. This classification underscores the extreme adoration for small female feet prevalent at the time. In a patriarchal society, women held virtually no societal status, existing mainly to fulfill male aesthetic desires and needs. As such, every aspect of a woman, including her physical form, was tailored to please men. The practice of foot binding led to broken arches, with heels and toes tightly folded under, severely hampering mobility and making it nearly impossible for women to walk long distances or engage in labor jobs. However, this restriction on women's mobility served more than just aesthetic appeal. It was deeply rooted in economic considerations. According to research by Melissa Brown, a Harvard anthropologist, and Damien Satterthwaite Phillips, a data scientist, restricting women's mobility provided economic security for their natal and marital families. Women who could not travel far were confined to home-based tasks such as spinning and weaving, the results of which could be sold by the family for income. Therefore, footbinding was not just a cultural tradition, but also an economic strategy, ensuring that women's labor benefited their families by limiting their freedom of movement. Against this cultural and economic backdrop, the practice of footbinding was deeply embedded in society. However, as time passed, societal reflection on this tradition deepened. By the late Qing dynasty, with rising calls for reform, reformists began to push for the abolition of footbinding, hoping to enhance the nation's image and improve the quality of life for women. Although these early efforts did not immediately succeed, they laid a solid foundation for later social transformations. In the early 20th century, with the outbreak of the Xinhai Revolution, Sun Yat-sen's provisional government issued a decree banning footbinding. Sun believed that a nation's strength begins with the health of its people. Hence, he advocated for the abolition of footbinding to improve the physical fitness of the populace. Violators of this decree, including those who practiced footbinding and their family members, faced penalties. During this period, numerous societies advocating for women's liberation from footbinding were established. As the new culture movement emerged, the anti-footbinding movement spread to major coastal cities and began to penetrate inland areas. By 1929, the nationalist government issued a further directive, the Liberation of Feet Proclamation, and appointed officials to enforce this policy. However, it was not until the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949 that the practice of footbinding truly began to die out. The last recorded instance of footbinding occurred in 1957 in Liuyi Village, Tonghai County, located 140 kilometers south of Kunming in Yunnan Province, known as China's last footbinding village. As of 2004, there were still 22 elderly women in the village who had undergone footbinding. Additionally, the last factory in China that manufactured shoes for bound feet, located in Harbin, closed in November 1999, marking the end of an era. The abolition of the footbinding custom allows us to witness a transformation from pain and oppression to liberation and equality. Also, let us remember that although change is difficult, hope and perseverance can pave the way to a better future.